The man drove the chalk mark straight across her front door, like the house was already dead. Ruth Calloway watched him do it. Didn't move. Didn't speak. Daniel had built that door with his own hands in the summer of 1874. Had hung it crooked the first time, and rehung it twice until the fit was right. And now a stranger, in a city suit, was dragging chalk across it and writing a number underneath. $3,100. Everything she had left in this world, reduced to chalk on wood. She had $87 in the strong box. Then hoofbeats hit the road hard, and a stranger's voice cut through everything. How much does she owe? Before I tell you what happens next, stay with me until the very end of this story. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far Ruth's story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Hit that button and the bell beside it, because I have more stories like this one, and I don't want you to miss a single word. Ruth Anna Calloway had been awake since 3 in the morning. Not from fear. She was past fear. Fear was what she'd felt in the first weeks after Daniel drowned. That cold, drowning feeling she'd carried everywhere, waking and sleeping, for 2 months straight. What she felt now was different. Cleaner. The particular clarity that comes when the worst thing has already been named, and all that's left is to stand in front of it without flinching. She'd gone through the numbers again at Daniel's desk, with the lamp turned low. Not because she'd missed something. She hadn't missed anything. $3,140. Principal, interest, legal fees, penalties for late correspondence. She'd folded the letter and put it back in the drawer and gone out to feed the horses before sunrise. Because the horses still needed feeding, whether the world was ending or not. That was what 6 years of running a relay station did to you. It made the work more real than the catastrophe. Delia found her in the barn at 6:30. Delia Foss had worked the Calloway station since the 2nd year, and she didn't soften things, which was one of the reasons Ruth had kept her, and one of the reasons Ruth trusted her completely. Whitfield's coming at 8, Delia said from the doorway. He sent word to Henderson last night. Henderson told his wife. His wife told the whole town by breakfast. Ruth pushed hay into the gray mare's stall. I know. You eaten? Not hungry. That's not what I asked. Ruth set down the fork and looked at her. What are people saying? In town. Delia was quiet for a moment, and that quiet meant something specific. They're saying Daniel borrowed against the station without telling you. That Whitfield's company has held the land as collateral since 1876. She paused. And they're saying a woman alone can't hold a relay station on contested border territory. That it was only a matter of time. The words hit the way they were meant to. Ruth stood with them. Pastor Devlin thinks I should sell voluntarily, she said. Preserve my dignity. How did you know that? Because it's exactly the thing Pastor Devlin would think. Ruth picked up the fork again. Go put coffee on, Delia. Strong enough to stand up on its own. Already did. They went inside. Ruth ate cornbread she didn't taste and drank coffee that was as strong as promised. And when she heard the wagon wheels on the road, she stood up from the table, smoothed her skirt once with both hands, and walked to the door. 3 men. 2 carriages with the Western Territories Land and Development Company seal on the doors. Edgar Thorne Whitfield stepped down from the lead carriage with his hat already coming off, already performing his courtesy before he'd taken 3 steps. He was a big man, not loud big, but deliberate big. The kind of size that came from knowing you could take up space and nobody would tell you to stop. He wore his suit like a man who wore suits everywhere, including places that didn't deserve them. Mrs. Calloway, warm voice, warm eyes, both of them calculated. I'm deeply sorry it's come to this. Are you? He stopped at the foot of her porch steps. Your husband was a man of genuine character. What he built here—" "Mr. Whitfield," Ruth kept her voice level, "there's a man behind you with chalk in his hand, walking toward my barn door. Tell him to stop." Whitfield turned slightly. The man, Doyle, she'd learn later, hesitated. "The assessment has to begin somewhere, Mrs. Calloway." "Not on my barn door, it doesn't." "The property is collateral. Technically and legally, my husband built that barn with his own hands, and your assessor is not going to drag chalk across it while I'm standing here watching." Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. "Tell him to start with the equipment inventory and work toward the buildings. Give me that much." Whitfield studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once to Doyle, who changed direction. "You've reviewed the documentation," Whitfield said. "Thoroughly. Then you understand the position." "I understand your position clearly, Mr. Whitfield." Ruth looked at him directly. "This station sits on the exact strip of land your survey map put in the path of the Denver and Pacific Rail line. The debt is your instrument. The land is your target." Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise. Recalculation. "The debt is the debt, Mrs. Calloway. Whatever future development may or may not, you don't have to confirm it. Your face already did." She looked past him to where Doyle was now cataloging equipment near the water trough, and the legal man, Crane, had his case open on the carriage hood, and everything she and Daniel had built over 6 years was being quietly disassembled into line items. "How long does the assessment take?" 2 to 3 hours, after which I'll need you to—" "I know what comes after." She turned and went back inside, because she needed 30 seconds where nobody could see her face. Delia was at the counter. She didn't say anything. She just put a fresh cup of coffee on the near end and went back to her work. And Ruth picked up the cup and stood at the window and watched Doyle move through the yard, and tried to remember the last time she'd slept a full night, and couldn't. Daniel had borrowed the money to expand the relay barn. That much she'd pieced together from the papers she'd found 3 months after he died. He'd believed the station was about to triple in value once the rail survey came through. And he'd been right. It was. Except he'd borrowed from the wrong man. Whitfield's company didn't want their money back. They wanted the land sitting on top of the rail corridor. And a dead man's unpaid debt was the cleanest way to get it. She set down the cup. She picked up the survey map she'd taken from the desk drawer and spread it on the counter, the one with the red pencil line on it, and looked at it for the last time. Then she folded it up and put it in her pocket. If she was going to lose everything Daniel died building, she would at least lose it knowing exactly what she was losing it to. She was still standing there when she heard the horse. One horse, coming up the road at a controlled lope. The hoofbeats even and unhurried. And what was strange about it was that nobody outside had noticed. She could see Whitfield's back through the window, still standing near the lead carriage, and he hadn't turned. Doyle was writing in his ledger. Neither of them had heard it. The rider pulled up in the yard without announcement, stepped down from the saddle in one motion, and stood there looking at the scene in front of him, the way a man looks at something he's trying to understand quickly. He was lean and trail-worn, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a jaw that needed 2 days of attention, and gray eyes that were doing the kind of rapid assessment she associated with men who'd trained themselves to read situations fast. Good clothes under the dust, a rifle in the scabbard, a revolver on his hip, the holster worn pale from long use. He'd stayed in her relay barn last night. She recognized the horse. "Ma'am?" He said it quietly, looking at her through the window, then shifted his gaze to Whitfield. "This a foreclosure?" "Sir," Whitfield said, turning, "this is a private matter. How much does she owe?" The flatness of it stopped Whitfield mid-sentence. "I beg your pardon?" "The total amount. Principal, fees, everything. What's the number? I don't believe that's any concern of $3,140, Doyle said automatically, looking up from his ledger. He had the look of a man who answered direct questions before he thought about whether he should. Whitfield shot him a look that could have stripped paint. The rider reached into his coat. Ruth came out onto the porch. He had 2 leather pouches on the porch railing before she'd taken 3 steps, heavy enough to thud when they landed, and he was reaching into his vest pocket for a roll of currency when she said, "Stop." He stopped, looked at her. "Who are you?" she said. "Cole Mason." He said it plainly, no performance to it. "I came in last night, stayed in your relay barn." He glanced at the pouches on the railing. "I have enough to cover the debt." Ruth stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "No, ma'am." "You don't know anything about my situation." "I know $3,100. I know 8 horses in that corral. I know a land company's seal on those carriages and a man with chalk in his hand." His eyes held hers, steady and undecorated. "I know enough." "Why?" The question was too short for the weight it carried. He seemed to understand that. "That's a longer answer than this porch is the right place for," he said. "But the short version is, I have the money, and it hasn't been useful to me until right now." He paused. "Will you let me pay it?" Ruth looked at the pouches on the railing. She looked at Whitfield, who had gone very still with the expression of a man watching control slip through his fingers and calculating how to get it back. She looked at Doyle, still holding his pencil over the ledger. She looked at Daniel's hitching post at the corner of the yard, the one he'd carved their initials into as a joke in 1874, a month after they'd finished building the station, standing in the summer heat, laughing at her when she said it was a school children's thing to do. "Pay it," she said. Cole Mason set the second pouch on the railing and counted the currency out beside it, and Whitfield watched with the particular stillness of a man who can't stop what's happening and knows better than to try. The count came to $3,160, $20 over. "Write a receipt," Cole said to Whitfield, "signed and dated, stating the debt of Callaway Station to Western Territories Land and Development is paid in full as of today. Every dollar." "Mr. Mason," Whitfield said carefully, "I want you to understand that paying this debt conveys no legal interest whatsoever in the property." "I know what it conveys. Write the receipt." "The company will have questions about the source of these funds." "Write the receipt." Whitfield wrote it. Crane witnessed it. The scratch of pen on paper was the only sound in the yard. Cole read it twice before he folded it into his coat. "Mrs. Callaway," Whitfield said, turning to her with the smile back in place and colder than before, "you should be aware that while your immediate debt has been satisfied, the underlying land situation remains." "I heard what he said," Ruth said. "You got your money. Now get off my property." Whitfield settled his hat back on his head. "This isn't finished." "It is for today," Cole said. The carriages rolled out. Ruth stood on the porch and watched them go, all the way to the road bend, all the way until the dust settled and the sound faded and the yard was quiet. She stood there until her hands stopped shaking, which took longer than she would have liked. Behind her, Delia said from the doorway, "I'll make fresh coffee." "Yes," Ruth said. "Do that." Cole was standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, not pushing, just waiting. There was a patience in how he stood, not passive, not uncomfortable, just still, like a man who'd learned that some moments needed to finish themselves before the next one could start. "Come inside," Ruth said. She sat him at the table in the front room, and Delia put coffee in front of him without ceremony, and Ruth sat across from him and looked at him straight, because she had always found that directness cost less time than anything else. "Talk," she said. He turned the cup in his hands once. Then he looked up. I worked Pinkerton 8 years, he said. Left 3 years ago. He said it the way a man recites a fact he's had to recite before, worn smooth from repetition. When I left, I had $3,100 in back pay they owed me. I took it. I've been carrying it ever since. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because I made a call on a case, and a man died for it. Innocent man. I was certain. I was wrong about the part that mattered. He looked at the coffee. 3 years of hire work after that, guarding silver, escorting freight. Money sitting in a saddlebag, and nothing worth spending it on. Until this morning. Until this morning. Ruth studied him. She had a talent for reading people. Running a border relay station meant she saw every kind of man there was, and she'd learned to read them fast or pay for it. Cole Mason was carrying something old and heavy, and he wasn't trying to hide it, which already made him different from most men who carried weight. They dressed it up or buried it. He just sat with it. You paid $3,100, she said, for a woman you don't know, on a property you've never seen in daylight. Yes, ma'am. And now you want what? He set down the cup. I want to stay. He said it plainly, no decoration. Not the way that could sound. I'm not... He stopped, started again more carefully. This station is still in trouble, you know that. Whitfield's going to come back with a different instrument. The rail question doesn't disappear because the debt's paid. A woman holding contested land alone on this corridor is a target, and the kind of men Whitfield works with don't stop at paper. I've been holding it alone for 3 years. You have, and you're still standing, which tells me more about you than most things I could learn. He leaned forward slightly. I know how Whitfield's company operates. I spent 8 years learning exactly that kind of operation from the inside. I know what comes next, and I can help stop it. He paused. If you'll let me. What do you want in return? Work, room and board. He held her gaze. And something to do that's worth doing. Ruth was quiet. Outside, she could hear the horses in the corral. She could hear Delia moving behind the counter, not pretending she wasn't listening. If I say no, Ruth said, then the debt's paid and you've got room to breathe. I'll ride on. You'd walk away from $3,100. It's already gone. I gave it to you. That part's done either way. Ruth stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the yard, at the corral where Daniel's horses stood in the morning light, at the relay barn, with its roof he'd patched twice and meant to replace properly come spring of the year he didn't live to see, at the hitching post with the initials carved in it. She reached into her pocket and took out the survey map, spread it on the counter between them without explanation. Cole looked at it, looked at the red pencil line running through the eastern pasture, looked up at her. He wanted the land from the beginning, Ruth said. The debt was just the cleanest road to it. Yes. You knew that when you paid. I suspected it. You confirmed it when you named the rail line to his face. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. Most people don't do that. Name the thing directly. Naming it doesn't scare me, Ruth said. Losing it does. She folded the map and put it back in her pocket. She looked at Cole Mason sitting at her kitchen table in the station that was somehow still hers, and she thought about Whitfield's face when he said, "This isn't finished," and about the winter coming, and about the roof on the relay barn, and about the $87 in the strongbox. I'll give you my answer in the morning, she said. That's fair. It's not an invitation to convince me tonight. I wasn't planning on it. He stood, picked up his hat. Mrs. Calloway. He looked at her directly. No performance, no appeal, just the plain statement of it. I'm not asking you to trust me. I know that takes time you haven't got reason to spend on a stranger. I'm asking for the chance to earn it. Those are different things. He went out. Ruth stood at the window and watched him cross the yard. He went to the water trough and checked that the horses had enough. He checked the relay barn latch, which had been sticking since October. He picked up the feed bucket she'd left by the corral gate and hung it on its proper peg without being asked. None of it was performance. Nobody was watching. He just did it because it needed doing. Delia came to stand beside her. "Well," Delia said, "don't. I haven't said a word. You have a whole vocabulary that doesn't use words." Ruth watched Cole disappear into the relay barn. He's either exactly what he says he is, or he's something I've never seen before. Which do you think? Ruth was quiet a long moment. That's the problem, she said finally. I can't tell. And I've always been able to tell. She went back to Daniel's desk and sat down. She opened the drawer and took out the letter from Whitfield's company, the one with the $3,100 figure and the final notice stamp, and she held it over the lamp flame and watched it burn down to nothing in the tin dish she kept for correspondence she was finished with. Then she put out the lamp. Outside in the dark, past the window, past the corral, past the hitching post with the crooked initials in it, she could still hear Cole Mason working. Not for show, not for her. Just working, because he was there and the work needed doing. And apparently, that was the kind of man he was. All right, Daniel, Ruth said quietly to the empty room. I'm listening. She went to bed. For the first time in 6 months, she didn't wake at 3. Ruth woke before dawn to the sound of an axe. Not frantic chopping, steady, measured strokes. The kind that came from someone who'd learned long ago that rhythm did more work than force. She lay still for a moment in the gray dark and listened. And the sound was so ordinary, so completely without threat, that it took her a full minute to remember there was a stranger in her relay barn who had no business touching her woodpile. She dressed quickly and went out. The cold hit her face before she cleared the porch. Cole Mason was at the splitting stump behind the barn, working in the half-light with his coat off despite the temperature, moving through a rhythm that suggested he'd been at it a while. The woodpile beside him was already significantly larger than it had been at sundown. I didn't say you could do that, Ruth said. He paused mid-swing, looked at her. The wood box inside was down to 4 pieces. Winter's 10 days out by the look of that sky. He set the axe head on the stump. I can stop if you want. I don't want you stopping. I want you asking. He considered that. Fair. May I split your wood, Mrs. Calloway? You may. She crossed her arms against the cold. And you were up before me. I sleep light. How long have you been out here? Since 4. Ruth looked at the woodpile. 2 hours of work, minimum. She looked at him, standing there in his shirt sleeves, in near freezing air, waiting to see if she was going to send him back inside. Delia makes breakfast at 6, she said. Don't be late. She has opinions about people who are late to breakfast. She went back inside before he could answer. Delia was already at the stove when Ruth came through the door, and she had the expression of a woman who had heard that entire exchange through the kitchen window and was choosing not to comment on it, which was its own kind of comment. He's been up since 4, Ruth said. I know. I heard him at 3:30 getting water from the pump. You were awake at 3:30. I'm always awake at 3:30. You know that. Delia cracked 2 eggs into the pan without looking at her. Man can't sleep. Man gets up, and find something useful to do, instead of lying there making it everyone else's problem. I've seen worse habits. I haven't said yes yet. I know you haven't. I told him I'd give him my answer this morning. I know that too. Ruth sat down at the table. Say what you want to say, Delia. Delia turned from the stove. She had the particular stillness she got when she was about to say something that cost her something to say. I want to say that Whitfield is coming back, she said. I want to say that the answer to everything wrong with this station right now is capital and another pair of hands and somebody who knows how to read legal instruments before they bite you. And I want to say that a man who gets up at 3:30 in the cold to split wood for a woman who hasn't even said yes to him yet is a particular kind of man. She turned back to the eggs. That's all I want to say. Ruth sat with that. Cole came in at exactly 6, washed up at the pump outside first, and sat where Delia pointed without any fuss about it. He ate what he was given and said it was good and meant it, and he didn't talk until Ruth talked first, which she appreciated more than she expected to. Tell me about the rail line, she said. He looked up. What do you know already? I know the Denver and Pacific Survey came through in the spring of 1876. I know the proposed route runs through the eastern pasture of this station. I know Daniel saw the survey map and thought it meant the land value was going up and borrowed against it. She set down her cup. I know Whitfield's company bought the debt from the original lender 6 months after Daniel died. I know they've been patient because patient is cheaper than contested. Cole was quiet for a moment. You've done your homework. It's my land. What you don't know, he said, is that the Denver and Pacific Survey was approved by the territorial legislature in August. Construction begins in the spring. The corridor land acquisition window closes in February. He looked at her steadily. Whitfield doesn't have until whenever. He has 4 months, which means he's going to move faster now, and he's going to use something other than the debt next time. Ruth absorbed that. What does faster look like? Could be legal. Challenge your right to hold the land without a male cosigner on the deed. Some territories still have provisions for that. Kansas doesn't. No, but Colorado does, and the corridor crosses both. Depends on how his lawyers argue the jurisdiction. He picked up his coffee. Could be extra legal. Accidents happen on relay stations. Horses get sick. Buildings catch fire. A woman alone on border territory with no man attached to the property. There's nobody who's going to ask hard questions about bad luck. The directness of it would have been brutal from anyone else. From Cole, it landed as information, which was somehow more frightening because it meant he was treating her as someone who could handle it. And you can stop that, Ruth said. I could make it harder. I know how Whitfield's company operates because I spent 2 years tracking a similar outfit in Missouri for Pinkerton. Same structure. Buy debt on corridor land. Wait for default or manufacture a crisis. Acquire it below market value before the rail company's purchase price drives it up. He set down the cup. I know where they cut corners. I know what a judge will look at and what he won't. And I know how to make a property look like more trouble than it's worth to a company that's running against a deadline. Ruth looked at him across the table. She had been thinking about this since she'd gone to bed last night. Thinking about it and trying to find the angle, because in her experience, men who appeared with money and solutions always had angles. And the ones who claimed not to were usually the most dangerous because they'd buried the angle somewhere you wouldn't find it until it was too late. She couldn't find Cole Mason's angle. That scared her more than Whitfield. What happened to the man? She said. The innocent man. Cole went very still. His name was Henry Carver, he said finally. Ran a freight operation out of Abilene. I was tracking a theft ring. The evidence pointed at him hard, and I was certain. Went in with 3 other agents and a warrant. He paused. He ran. Scared, not guilty. I know the difference now, but I didn't then. He took a shot. He died. He looked at the table. The actual man we wanted turned himself in 6 weeks later because the guilt was eating him. Made a full confession. Named everyone. Henry Carver was nowhere in it. The room was quiet.
I took my pay and I left, Cole said. Couldn't stay in work that required me to trust my own certainty after that. And I couldn't spend the money on anything that felt like it deserved it. He looked up at her. Until yesterday morning. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. You think paying my debt settles something, she said. With Henry Carver. No, he said it without hesitation. Nothing settles that. I know that. But I've been useless for 3 years, and I'm tired of being useless. He held her gaze. I can help you hold this land. That's a real thing I can do. Whether it balances some scale somewhere, that's not why I'm asking. Delia was washing dishes at the counter with the focused attention of a woman finding every pot absolutely fascinating. Ruth made her decision. She'd made it somewhere before she sat down, probably before she got out of bed, probably in the moment last night when she heard him still working in the dark. She just needed to hear him say what he'd said about Henry Carver, because she needed to know that the guilt was real and not performance. Performance she could spot. What Cole carried was real. 6 months, she said. That's when the acquisition window closes for Whitfield. You stay through February. We hold the land past the deadline, and Whitfield loses his leverage. She looked at him steadily. Room and board, $1 a day on top of that. You take direction from me on the station operations, and from Delia on everything that happens inside this building. Agreed. If you lie to me about anything, your past, your intentions, anything, I'll put you off this property the same day I find out. Agreed. And if you ever make a decision that affects this land without consulting me first, we're finished. This is my station, my name on the deed. You work for me, not with me. That can change over time if you earn it. But that's where we start. Cole looked at her for a moment, with something she couldn't quite name in his expression. Not offense. Something closer to the reaction of a man who'd expected to have to negotiate harder and found he respected not having to. Agreed, he said. All of it. Then finish your breakfast, Ruth said. The relay barn roof needs proper work before the first hard snow, and I want to walk the eastern pasture before noon so you can show me exactly where the survey line runs and what Whitfield's lawyers are going to argue about jurisdiction. She stood up and took her plate to the counter, and Delia took it from her without looking up. And the morning moved forward the way mornings did on a working station, which was to say, without ceremony and without pause. The eastern pasture in November was winter brown and wide, and the survey stakes were still in the ground from the spring assessment. Weather-beaten orange flags, mostly faded to yellow now. Cole walked the line with her, pointing out where the jurisdiction argument would hinge, where the property boundary conflicted with the territorial claim, where a competent lawyer could create enough ambiguity to tie up a deed challenge in court past the February deadline. Ruth listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both of them precise, and Cole answered them precisely. And somewhere in the middle of that walk, she began to understand what she was working with. Not a rescuer. Not a man who'd arrived with all the answers. A man with specific, useful knowledge, and the kind of mind that organized information the way she organized a relay schedule. Practically, without waste. Daniel should have told me, she said. They were standing at the northern survey stake, looking back toward the station building. About the loan. About the land value. Why didn't he? Because he thought he was handling it. She said it without bitterness, because she'd worked through the bitterness in the months after she found the papers and come out the other side of it. Daniel handled things. It was his best quality and his worst one. He didn't want me worrying about money when he was certain it was going to work out.
She paused. He was right that the land was going to be worth more. He was just wrong about having enough time. He died in the flood. April, trying to get the horses across the smoky hill before the water rose too high. 6 horses. She looked at the relay barn. He saved 5 of them. A beat. That was Daniel. 5 out of 6, and he'd have spent the rest of his life thinking about the one. Cole didn't say anything to that, which was the right response. There was nothing to say. He just stood beside her and let the weight of it be what it was. After a moment, she said, "Tell me what we file first." He looked at her. The shift was visible, away from the personal and back to the practical, and she could see he appreciated that she'd made it, because he'd been in exactly the same place with his own grief, and she suspected he didn't yet know how to navigate other people's. "We file a notice of intent with the Territorial Land Office in Wichita," he said. "Establishes your active operation of the property and puts your deed on record as a currently working concern. Makes it harder to argue abandonment or incapacity." He turned to walk back toward the station. "Then we write to the Denver and Pacific directly. Not Whitfield's company, the railroad itself. Let them know there's a willing seller at fair market value if the route comes through as surveyed. That takes the desperation out of Whitfield's position. If you're already in negotiation with the railroad directly, his debt instrument loses its value as leverage." Ruth stopped walking. "You want me to offer to sell?"
I want you to make it look like you might. There's a difference. He stopped beside her. Right now, Whitfield holds all the options. You can refuse to sell and fight the deed challenge and maybe win in February when his window closes. Or you can let him foreclose and lose everything. Those are the only 2 choices he wants you to see. He looked at her. The third choice is to go over his head and deal with the people he's working for. The railroad doesn't care about Edgar Whitfield. They care about acquiring the corridor land cleanly and on schedule. If they can get it from you directly at fair market value without a legal mess, they'll take that deal over Whitfield's acquisition every time. Ruth stared at him. "You're not trying to save the station," she said slowly. "You're trying to save the land value. I'm trying to make sure that if the rail line comes through your eastern pasture, you're the one who benefits from it, not Whitfield." She looked at him for a long moment in the thin November light. The wind was picking up from the northwest, the kind of wind that carried a promise in it. "Daniel would have liked you," she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. Cole looked surprised. It was the first time she'd seen him surprised. The expression lasted about 2 seconds, and then he put it away. But she'd seen it. "He sounds like a man worth liking," Cole said. He was. She started walking again. "Come on. I need to wire Wichita before the afternoon stage comes through." They went back to the station, and Delia had coffee waiting and the look of a woman who had watched them come back from the pasture together and was drawing her own conclusions and had the good sense not to say them out loud yet. Ruth drafted the wire to the land office with Cole looking over her shoulder, and he suggested 2 changes of phrasing that tightened it considerably. And she made the changes without comment, because they were better, and she was not too proud to know when something was better. The afternoon stage came through at 2 with 4 passengers and a mail pouch, and 3 horses that needed changing. Ruth ran it the way she always ran it, efficiently, quickly, with the rotation system she and Daniel had developed in the first year, and she'd refined alone in the 3 years since. Cole watched the first horse change, and was in the corral helping with the second before she'd asked him. Reading what was needed and doing it correctly, which told her he'd worked stations before or something close to them. After the stage left, a rider came in from the south. Young man, maybe 20, who said he'd heard in town that the Callaway station was hiring. Ruth looked at Cole. Cole looked at her. "What's your experience?" Ruth said to the young man. 2 years on the Morrison relay, south of Dodge. Before that,
ranch work in Texas. He had the direct, slightly nervous energy of someone who needed work and wasn't too proud to say so. I'm good with horses. I don't drink on the job. I show up. References. Jack Morrison will vouch for me, ma'am. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She was not in a position to be turning away competent help with winter coming and Whitfield's deadline bearing down, and she knew it. $1 a day and board, she said. You start tomorrow. Bunk with Mr. Mason in the relay barn. The young man, his name was Will Pruitt, she'd learned over supper, looked relieved in the way that people looked relieved when the worst possible outcome had not occurred. That evening, after supper, after Will had gone to the barn and Delia had gone to her room, Ruth sat at Daniel's desk in the lamplight and went through the accounts the way she did every night. The numbers looked different now than they had 24 hours ago. Not good, not yet, but possible. Possibility was something she hadn't been able to find in these numbers for 6 months. She heard Cole come out of the relay barn, cross the yard, stop at the porch steps. Mrs. Calloway. He kept his voice low, not wanting to wake anyone. She turned the lamp up slightly so the light fell across the window. Yes? Whitfield was in town this afternoon, before the stage came through. He was talking to the land office clerk. Ruth absorbed that. Doing what? I don't know yet, but I'll know by tomorrow. She looked at him through the window. He was standing at the bottom of the porch steps in the dark, and she could only see the shape of him, the particular stillness she was already starting to recognize. Thank you for telling me, she said. You said no decisions without consulting you, he said simply. That goes both ways. You should know what I know when I know it. He went back to the relay barn. Ruth sat at the desk for a long time after the lamp burned low, with the account book open in front of her and the survey map folded in her pocket, and Whitfield's name sitting in the room like a stone she hadn't finished moving yet. She was not safe. She knew that clearly. The debt was paid, but the danger had simply changed its shape. And she was standing in the middle of a 4-month window with a man she'd known for 36 hours and a 19-year-old hand who'd shown up by coincidence, and whatever Cole Mason had been able to learn from a conversation in town. But the numbers in the account book were possible instead of impossible. And outside in the relay barn, 2 men she had chosen were sleeping in positions she had given them. Ruth Calloway closed the account book, put out the lamp, and went to bed. She did not think about what it had felt like when Cole said, "That goes both ways." The quiet certainty of it, the way it had landed in her chest, like something setting itself in the right place after a long time out of alignment. She did not think about it, but she noted it, the way she noted everything that mattered on this station, carefully and without waste, in the part of herself where she kept the things she wasn't ready to name yet. Cole found out what Whitfield had been doing at the land office by 8 the next morning. He came in from town with his coat still on and mud on his boots from the road, and the particular expression Ruth had already learned meant he had information he wasn't sure how to deliver. She was at the counter sorting the morning mail. She looked at his face and put down the mail pouch. "Tell me," she said. He filed a competency challenge on the deed. The room went quiet. Delia stopped moving at the stove. "On what grounds?" Ruth said. Argues that Daniel's loan agreement contained a joint tenancy clause, requiring both signatures for any transfer or legal action on the property. Since Daniel signed a loan, Whitfield's lawyer is claiming the original loan was invalid, which means the payoff I made yesterday was also invalid, which means the debt technically still stands under a different legal instrument. Cole watched her face. It's a manufactured argument, but it'll hold up long enough to create a cloud on the deed, which is all he needs. If the title's in dispute, the railroad can't acquire directly from you. They'd have to wait for resolution, and Whitfield's company would offer to resolve it by buying the contested claim. Ruth stood very still. She understood exactly what had happened. She'd outmaneuvered him yesterday by naming the rail line, so he'd spent the afternoon building a new door into the same room. Edgar Whitfield was not a man who accepted being outmaneuvered. He was a man who found the next angle before you'd finished celebrating the last one. "How long does a deed challenge take to resolve?" she said. "Contested, with a competent lawyer on both sides? 4 to 6 months, minimum. The acquisition window closes in February." "Yes." "Which means he doesn't need to win the challenge. He just needs it to be unresolved in February." "Yes," Cole said again, and his voice had the quality of a man who respected her for getting there fast. Ruth turned and looked out the window at the eastern pasture, at the relay barn, at Will Pruitt crossing the yard with a feed bucket, 19 years old, and completely unaware that the ground under all of them had just shifted again. "Who's the best land lawyer in Wichita?" she said. "Man named Arthur Greer. I worked with him on 2 Pinkerton cases. He's honest, he's fast, and he has a particular dislike for deed manipulation schemes, because he lost his father's farm to one in 1861. Cole paused. "He'll cost money." "How much?" $200 up front. More if it goes to a full hearing." Ruth did the math without showing it on her face. She had $87 in the strongbox, which was now $87 of actual operating capital since the debt was cleared, plus the monthly relay contract from the Territorial Mail Service, plus whatever horse sales she could move before February. $200 was not impossible. It was close to impossible, but not all the way there. "Wire him today," she said. "Tell him what's happened. Tell him I need a response on the joint tenancy argument by the end of the week." "I'll go now." "Cole?" He stopped. "You said you worked with him. Does he know your name?" Something crossed Cole's face. "He knows the name I used on those cases. John Merritt." Ruth looked at him steadily. "Is there a reason you used a different name?" "Standard Pinkerton practice on some operations. The name's clean. Greer trusted it. I can use it in the wire." "I'm not asking if it's clean. I'm asking if there's something attached to Cole Mason that I need to know about." The pause was half a second too long. "There's a man in Missouri who'd like to have a conversation with me about the Carver case," he said. "Henry's brother. He's not wrong to want it. I've been avoiding it because I don't have anything to say to him that changes what happened." He held her gaze. "It's not a legal problem. It's a personal one. It won't affect anything here." Ruth considered that. It had the texture of truth. Not the smooth texture of a prepared answer, but the rough texture of something a man said because he'd decided to stop editing it. "Use whatever name gets Greer on the wire fastest," she said. "Go." He went. Delia waited until the door closed. "A false name." "A work name," Ruth said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "I used to sign the freight manifests as R.D. Calloway because the Northern Freight Companies wouldn't deal with a woman's signature. Was that a false name or a practical one?" Delia was quiet for a moment. "Point taken," she said, and went back to the stove. The morning stage came through at 11, and Ruth ran it, and the afternoon stage came through at 3, and she ran that too. And in between, she wrote a letter to the Denver and Pacific Railroad's Territorial Acquisitions Office in Denver, not offering to sell, not threatening to fight, but establishing contact, establishing that the deed holder was actively engaged and legally represented and in direct communication with the railroad on the subject of the survey corridor. It was the letter Cole had suggested, and she wrote it in her own words, which were sharper than his draft and slightly more direct. And when she showed it to him at supper, he read it and said, "Better than what I had," and meant it. Will Pruitt, 3 days into the job, had settled into the station's rhythm the way good hands did, quietly and without requiring management. He did what he was told, learned the relay rotation fast, had a natural ease with the horses that Ruth noticed and approved of. He also, she observed, watched Cole with the particular attention of a young man deciding whether to trust someone older, which told her Will Pruitt had enough experience to know that not all men who appeared useful were safe. She watched Cole earn it, not through grand gestures, through consistency, through doing what he said he would do, when he said he would do it, without needing to be checked on. The wire from Arthur Greer came back in 2 days. It was longer than she expected.
She read it at Daniel's desk, with Cole standing beside her. And when she finished, she read it again. And then she set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. "He says the joint tenancy argument is weak," she said.
"I know, I read it."
"He says it's weak, but it's not dismissible without a filing. He needs 150, not 200. And he can have a counter-challenge filed by Friday." She paused. "He also says something else." Cole was quiet. He'd read the wire. He knew what else it said. "He says the man who put Whitfield's company onto this station in the first place wasn't Whitfield," Ruth said. "He says there's a land broker in Kansas City who's been identifying relay station properties on the corridor for 3 different acquisition companies, and the broker's name is being connected to 2 other deed challenges filed in the last 6 months on similar properties." She looked up at Cole. "Did you know that when you came here?"
"No." He said it directly, without defense. "I knew Whitfield's company. I didn't know about the broker." "But you know who it is." The pause was answer enough. Cole. "Man named Silas Burr," he said. "He ran freight intelligence for the same outfit I tracked in Missouri. When that operation went down, Burr wasn't charged because I couldn't put him in the same room as the principals. He walked." He looked at her. "I didn't come here because of Burr. I came here because of the money and because of what I saw happening in your yard. But if Burr is the broker behind this, it's a larger operation than one relay station. Whitfield is probably running 3 or 4 simultaneous acquisitions on the corridor." Ruth stood up from the desk. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, working through what this meant.
"You're telling me," she said carefully, "that the man who arranged for my husband's debt to be purchased by Whitfield's company is someone you have a history with?"
"Yes."
"And that history might bring attention to this station that has nothing to do with my land and everything to do with you?"
"Possibly." Ruth turned.
"Is that why you really came here, Cole? Because you traced Burr to this operation, and you wanted to finish what you couldn't finish in Missouri?"
The question landed hard. She could see it land. Cole stood there and let it land without flinching, which was either the behavior of an honest man or a very skilled one, and she was no longer sure she could tell the difference when it came to him specifically. "No," he said, "but I won't stand here and tell you it doesn't matter that he's connected to this, because it does matter, and you deserve to know it." He came forward and put both hands flat on the desk and looked at her directly.
"I came here for the reasons I told you. I have not lied to you about a single thing. But Burr being involved changes the risk. He knows my work methods. If he finds out I'm here, he'll use it."
"Use it how?"
"He'll tell Whitfield I'm a disgraced Pinkerton with a dead man's family looking for me, and an unresolved case history that a good lawyer can use to question my character as a witness. He'll try to make me the story instead of the deed challenge." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you this now because you need to decide if the risk of me being here outweighs the help I can give. That's your decision to make, not mine." The fire in the stove ticked in the silence. Ruth looked at him. At the man who had paid $3,100 for a stranger's debt and gotten up at 3:30 in the cold to split wood, and told her things that a smarter operator would have kept to himself, because she'd asked directly,
and he'd apparently made a decision somewhere to stop lying by omission.
"Sit down," she said. He sat. She sat across from him. "What does Burr look like?" Cole described him. Medium height, dark hair running to gray, a habit of wearing Eastern clothes in Western territories because he thought it made him look like money. A scar on his left hand from a freight accident in 1869. "I've seen him," Ruth said. Cole went still. "When?" 3 weeks before Daniel died. He came through on the northbound stage, paid for a horse change and a meal. He spent a long time at the window looking at the eastern pasture and asked me one question." She looked at Cole steadily. "He asked if we'd had the land surveyed recently." The silence that followed had a particular quality. "You didn't know what it meant then," Cole said. "I thought he was a land speculator making small talk. I told him the last survey was 1872. She paused. "He was gone on the next stage, and I forgot about him. Until right now." Cole sat back. The expression on his face was the one she'd seen in the pasture when she'd told him about Daniel dying, trying to save the horses. Not pity, something quieter than pity. The recognition that sometimes the worst things have been in motion for much longer than anyone knew. "He was scouting," Cole said, "for Burr. Buying dead is step 2. Step 1 is identification. He travels the corridor, identifies properties on the survey route, goes back to his desk in Kansas City, and finds every loan attached to those properties and starts acquiring them, quietly." He paused. Daniel's loan might have already been in Burr's sights before the flood. Ruth absorbed that. She absorbed all of it, the whole picture, the way it had been arranged around her and Daniel without either of them seeing it. The patience of it, the cold commercial patience of men who treated other people's lives as line items. "Daniel didn't borrow against the land because he thought it was going to be worth more," she said slowly. "Or not only that. He borrowed because someone made it easy for him to borrow. And easy money in 1876 on corridor land," she stopped, "came from someone who wanted to hold that debt," Cole finished. Ruth put her hands flat on the desk and looked at them. Daniel's hands had been bigger than hers, rougher, with a scar on the right palm from the sawmill accident in the second year. She could still see them as clearly as she could see her own. He hadn't been careless. He'd been maneuvered. There was a difference, and it mattered, even 3 years later, even when he wasn't there to know she'd figured it out. "All right," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Here's what we're going to do. We pay Greer the $150 and file the counter-challenge Friday. We send the letter to Denver and Pacific today. And you write down everything you know about Burr's operation method. Names, dates, properties, everything from Missouri. And I keep it in the strongbox." "Why?" "Because if something happens to you, I need to be able to walk into a judge's chambers and hand him a document that explains exactly who Silas Burr is and what he does." She looked at Cole. "And because if Burr finds out you're here and tries to use your past against you, I want ammunition ready before he starts shooting." Cole looked at her for a long moment, with the expression she'd seen only a few times, the one that lasted 2 seconds before he put it away. Not surprise, exactly. Something more complicated than surprise. "You're not afraid of this," he said. "I'm terrified of this," Ruth said. "But I'm more afraid of losing what Daniel died for than I am of Silas Burr." She stood up. "Write the document tonight. Everything you know." She picked up Greer's wire and the letter to Denver and Pacific and walked out to the porch. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, throwing long shadows across the yard. Will Pruitt was coming in from the corral, and he nodded to her as he passed, easy and respectful.
From inside, she could hear Delia starting supper. The familiar sounds of it: cast iron on the grate and water from the pump. Ruth stood on the porch and thought about Silas Burr sitting on her northbound stage 3 weeks before Daniel died, looking out at the eastern pasture, asking his single, careful question. She thought about Daniel sitting at this same desk, looking at a survey map with a red pencil line on it, and seeing possibility, never knowing the possibility had been laid in front of him deliberately. She thought about Cole Mason, who had arrived carrying the exact weight of the exact kind of wrong this was, and who had told her things tonight that a man protecting himself would never have told her. She thought about the letter in her hand to the Denver and Pacific Railroad, and about Arthur Greer in Wichita, who had lost his father's farm to a deed scheme in 1861, and who would therefore approach this particular case with the kind of motivation that money alone couldn't buy. Whitfield had moved fast today, faster than she'd expected, which meant he was worried, and worried men made mistakes. That was something. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The door opened behind her, and Cole came out. He stood beside her without touching her, looking at the same fading light. "I'll write the document tonight," he said. "I know." A pause. The wind moved through the yard. "Ruth?" He said her name for the first time without the "ma'am" attached, and she noticed it, the weight of it, the small shift it represented. "I'm sorry it's this complicated." "You didn't make it complicated," she said. "Burr did. Whitfield did." She looked at the eastern pasture, at the survey stakes with their faded flags. "You're the first thing in 6 months that's made it feel survivable." She went back inside before either of them could say anything else about it. But she heard him behind her, quiet and steady, and she heard the door close, and she heard him sit down at the desk and take out paper and pen, and the sound of him writing was still there when she finally stopped listening for it and let herself sleep. Arthur Greer's counter-challenge landed in the Wichita Territorial Land Office on a Friday, the same day Silas Burr rode into town on the southbound stage. Cole saw him first. He was coming back from the feed supplier when the stage pulled in at the Central Depot, and he recognized Burr the way you recognize a bad smell before you can name it. Something in the body before the mind catches up. Medium height, Eastern clothes, dark hair gone mostly gray now. The same unhurried way of stepping down from a carriage that belonged to a man who believed the world arranged itself around his arrival. Cole kept walking, did not change his pace, did not look directly at Burr again. He went back to the station, put the feed in the barn, and found Ruth at the relay counter, working through the afternoon manifest. "He's here," Cole said. Ruth set down her pen. She didn't ask who. "Did he see you?" "I don't know." "Did he look at you?" He was looking at the town, reading it, the way he does when he comes somewhere new. Cole stood with his hands at his sides, and Ruth could see the particular stillness in him that was not calm, but control. The deliberate management of something that wanted to move faster than he was allowing it. "He'll ask around, find out who's on the station. If anyone in town knows my face from Missouri work, he'll know I'm here by tonight." Ruth thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Go get Delia." Delia came in from the kitchen, drying her hands, and Ruth told her what Cole had told her. And Delia listened without expression, and then said, "What do you need?" "I need you to go into town. Not now, in an hour, when it's natural for you to be going for supplies. I need you to listen to what people are saying about the man who came in on the southbound stage. Don't ask directly. You know how to listen without asking." "I've been listening without asking my whole life," Delia said flatly, and took off her apron. Cole looked at Ruth. You're sending Delia to gather intelligence. I'm sending Delia to do what she's better at than either of us. Ruth looked at him steadily. You said Burr knows your work methods. Does he know you work alone? Always did. Then the thing he won't expect is that you have people. She picked up her pen again. Will's in the North Corral. Tell him if anyone comes to the station asking about the deed situation or the ownership, he doesn't know anything, and he comes to find me before he says another word. Cole nodded and went out. Ruth went back to the manifest, but she wasn't reading it. She was thinking about the document in the strongbox. Cole had written 11 pages the night before, dense and specific, names and dates and methods going back to the Missouri operation. The kind of document that a territorial judge would find difficult to set aside. She'd read it twice before locking it away. And what she'd read had told her two things. First, that Cole Mason had a precise, methodical mind that saw patterns the way she saw relay schedules, completely, without gaps. Second, that Silas Burr had destroyed at least 4 families she could count by name in the pages, and would have no hesitation about destroying a 5th. The afternoon stage came through at 3, and Ruth ran it and smiled at the passengers, and changed 3 horses and collected the mail pouch, and was completely, professionally herself, while her mind worked the problem like a stone in a current, turning it, wearing it down, looking for the weak place. Delia came back at 4:30. She came in through the kitchen door and went straight to the counter where Ruth was sorting mail, and spoke quietly enough that Will, working in the barn, couldn't have heard. He's asking about the deed challenge, Delia said. Went to the land office clerk first, then to Henderson's dry goods. Henderson's wife told him a man named Mason had paid the original debt.
She described Cole well enough. Delia paused. He asked if Mason had any connections in the territory, any family, anyone who'd vouch for him. What did Henderson's wife say? That she didn't know him from Adam, and neither did anyone else. Ruth exhaled slowly. Good. There's more. Delia folded her hands on the counter. He had supper at the hotel and talked to the man at the next table for 40 minutes. That man is James Cooley. Ruth went still. James Cooley was the Territorial Land Commissioner. He had been a fair and steady man for 8 years in that office, and Ruth had no reason to distrust him, and no reason to trust that Burr hadn't already found his particular weakness. What were they talking about? Ruth said. Cooley's boy has debts, Delia said. Gambling. It's not a secret among people who know things. Cooley's been carrying it quietly for 2 years. She held Ruth's gaze. Burr bought those debts last month. I found that out from the hotel cook, who heard it from Cooley's wife when she came in for washing. The room was very quiet. Ruth understood exactly what that meant. Burr hadn't come to town because the counter-challenge scared him. He'd come because the counter-challenge had forced him to move his secondary instrument earlier than planned. The deed challenge could be beaten in court, slowly, by Greer. So Burr was going to make sure the land commissioner found reasons to complicate Ruth's deed registration before Greer could finish the job. She went to the relay barn. Cole was mending a harness near the south wall, and Will was at the far end with the horses. She stopped near Cole and spoke low. Burr has Cooley, she said. Cooley's boy's gambling debts. He's going to use the commission to throw a flag on my deed registration. If Cooley delays the filing, Greer's counter-challenge lands on a contested registration, and Whitfield's lawyers have grounds to argue the whole thing is procedurally invalid. Cole set down the harness. His face had gone to that controlled stillness again. When? If he moves tonight or tomorrow, the filing window closes before Greer can respond. She watched his face. Tell me there's something in those 11 pages that I can use against Burr directly. Not in court. Now. Tonight.
Cole was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "There's a name," he said. "Woman in Abilene named Clara Briggs. Burr acquired her husband's freight company debt in 1874. Same method. And the husband died 3 months later in what was ruled an accident. Clara filed a report with the Pinkerton, Kansas office, claiming it wasn't an accident. The case was never pursued because there was no physical evidence, and Burr had already moved the operation to Missouri." He paused. "I took a statement from Clara in 1876. It's in the Pinkerton files under John Merritt. It was never used, but it exists. And if Cooley knew that Burr has a pattern of acquiring debts connected to men who die inconveniently, a man worried about his son's life would think twice about whose instrument he was willing to become," Cole said. Ruth looked at him. "Can you get to Cooley before Burr does?" "I need an hour." "You have 40 minutes. Burr's at the hotel. He'll move after dark." Cole was already reaching for his coat. "Cole!" He stopped. "Don't threaten Cooley. Don't even imply threat. Tell him the truth about Burr plainly, and let him make his own choice. He's a decent man in a bad position. Decent men in bad positions usually choose right if someone gives them the actual information instead of pressure." Cole looked at her with that expression again, the 2-second one. "You trust people more than I do." "I trust people accurately," she said, "which is different from trusting them completely. Go." He went. Ruth went back inside and sat at the desk and looked at her hands and waited, which was the hardest thing she'd done since the morning of the foreclosure. She was not a woman built for waiting. She was built for action, and the absence of it, while someone else carried the work, made something pull tight in her chest that she couldn't resolve by moving. Delia put coffee in front of her without being asked. "He'll handle it," Delia said. "I know. Then stop looking at the door like it owes you an explanation." Ruth almost smiled. Almost. "Delia." "What?" "If this works, if Greer's challenge holds and the railroad deals with us directly, and we come out of February with the deed clean." She paused. "What do I do about Cole?" Delia sat down across from her, which she almost never did at the desk. She folded her hands on the table and looked at Ruth with the direct, unhurried attention of a woman who had been waiting for this particular conversation. "What do you want to do about Cole?" she said. Ruth looked at the desk, at the ink stain in the left corner that Daniel had put there in the first winter when he'd knocked over the inkwell trying to get up quickly because he'd heard a horse in distress. He'd sworn about it for a week, and she'd laughed at him, and eventually they'd both stopped seeing it. "I want to know if I'm being practical or foolish," Ruth said, "and I can't tell. He came here with money and a guilty conscience and a past that's currently sitting in a hotel 3 miles away, waiting to be used against us. That's not uncomplicated." "No," Delia agreed. "It isn't." "Daniel was simple," Ruth said. "Not simple like he was uncomplicated, but simple like there was nothing hidden. What you saw was the whole thing. Cole isn't like that." "No, I don't know if I can do something that isn't like that." Delia was quiet for a moment. "You know what I think?" "You're going to tell me regardless." "I think Daniel being simple was what you needed when you were 24 years old, building a station from the ground up and needing someone whose whole self was present all the time. I think you're 38 now, and you've run this station alone for 3 years, and you're not the same woman who needed that." She held Ruth's gaze. "I think Cole Mason being complicated doesn't mean he's wrong for you. It might mean he's right in a different way." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "That's the most you've said to me about anything personal in 4 years," she said. "I've been saving it," Delia said, and stood up and went back to the stove. Cole came back at 7:30. He came in the front door without knocking, which he'd stopped doing 3 days ago. And Ruth could see in how he moved that something had gone the right way, but not entirely the right way. And she waited while he took his coat off and sat down. "Cooley listened," he said. "I told him about Clara Briggs, about the pattern. Showed him the page I'd copied from the document, the one with Burr's name and the Abilene dates." He looked at her. He turned white. Not because of the information, because of something specific in it. Ruth waited. The man in the Abilene case, the freight company owner who died. His name was Thomas Cooley. Cole held her gaze. James Cooley's older brother. He left Abilene in 1874, told the family he was selling the business and starting over in Colorado. The family never heard from him again. They assumed he'd chosen to disappear. Clara Briggs was his wife. The air in the room shifted. Ruth set down her cup. He didn't know. He didn't know. He thought his brother had abandoned the family. He's been carrying that for 4 years. Cole's voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. He was going to help Burr because he was afraid of what Burr would do with his son's debts. He didn't know he was helping the man who probably killed his brother. Ruth closed her eyes for just a moment. She opened them. "Where is Cooley now?" "He went directly to the telegraph office. He's wiring the territorial marshal in Wichita and the Pinkerton, Kansas office. He's also pulling Burr's hotel registration and holding it for the marshal. And the deed filing. He processed it himself tonight. Personally walked it through the registration and countersigned it as commissioner." Cole paused. "He also wrote a letter for Greer's files, documenting Burr's presence in town and the nature of their conversation. He said he wanted it on record before morning." Ruth sat with all of it for a moment, the weight of it. The strange way that the worst things sometimes contained inside them the mechanism for their own undoing. Burr's reach had gone so far and so deep that it had eventually touched the family of the man charged with regulating the very process Burr was trying to corrupt. "What about Burr?" she said. "Does he know?" "Not yet. He's still at the hotel." Cooley was careful. "But when the marshal's wire comes back, Burr is going to understand very quickly that this particular operation has collapsed." Cole looked at her directly. "He's going to look for who moved against him. And he's going to find me." "Then we need to be ready for that." "Ruth." He said her name the way he had on the porch, without the ma'am, and she felt the same thing she'd felt then, the small settling of something finding its place. What comes next won't be paper. Burr doesn't use paper when paper fails. He uses men who work at night and don't leave signatures. "I know." "You know." "I grew up on this border, Cole. I know what men who work at night look like and what they're willing to do." She met his eyes. "That's why we're not going to wait for him to decide we're a problem. We're going to make him understand tonight that the cost of moving against this station is higher than the value of the acquisition." Cole looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled stillness, and not the 2-second look. Something more open than either of those. Something that hadn't been closed off yet. "How?" he said. "Greer files in Wichita tomorrow. Cooley's documentation goes with it. The Denver and Pacific letter is already in Denver. And you," she paused, "I need you to wire the Pinkerton, Kansas office yourself tonight, under your real name, Cole Mason, not John Merritt. Tell them you have a sworn statement and 11 pages of documented evidence on Silas Burr's corridor acquisition scheme, and you're prepared to deliver it to the marshal or to the railroad's legal office, whichever moves faster. Cole stared at her. That puts my name in the open. Yes. Burr will know exactly where I am. Yes, and he'll know that everything you know is already distributed to 3 separate offices, and that killing you or burning this station doesn't erase it. She held his gaze. The only thing that makes us a target is if he thinks he can still control the outcome. Take that away, and we're not worth the trouble. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded decisions. Ruth could feel Cole working through it. The risk of it. The logic of it. The fact that it required him to stop hiding behind a work name and stand in his actual name, in front of consequences he'd been carrying for 3 years. You're asking me to stop running, he said quietly. I'm asking you to stop making it easy for him, Ruth said. There's a difference. She watched him. She watched him arrive at something inside himself, some ledger tipping past its balance point. And she didn't rush it, and she didn't look away. All right, he said finally. He went to the telegraph desk and wrote the wire out in full. Cole Mason, real name, real location, real evidence. And when he handed it to her to read before sending, she read it and gave it back without changes because it said exactly what needed saying. He sent it at 8:15. At 9, Will Pruitt came in from the barn to say there was a man on the road, stopped about 200 yards out, just sitting on a horse in the dark, looking at the station. Cole went to the door and opened it, and stood in the lamplight where he could be clearly seen. The man on the road sat there for a long moment. Then he turned and rode away. Ruth came to stand beside Cole in the doorway. They both watched the darkness where the rider had been. The night was cold and clear and full of stars, and the station was quiet behind them. Will and Delia and the horses, and the deed in the strongbox, and 11 pages of truth that were now in 3 places at once. He knows, Cole said. Yes. He'll go back to Burr. Yes. And then we'll see what Burr decides we're worth. Ruth looked at the empty road. At the eastern pasture beyond it, the survey stakes with their faded flags barely visible in the starlight. At the land that Daniel had borrowed against and died before he could protect, and that men had been quietly maneuvering to take for 3 years. Let him decide, she said. We'll be here. Cole stood beside her in the open doorway, and neither of them moved, and the cold came in around them, and neither of them moved for that either. And after a while, the road stayed empty, and the night stayed quiet, and Ruth became aware that she was standing closer to him than she needed to be, and that he had noticed and had not stepped back. She didn't step back either. She didn't name it, not yet, but she didn't step back. Come in out of the cold, Delia said, from somewhere behind them in the warm room. Both of you. Coffee's going to waste. Ruth almost laughed. She stepped back inside, and Cole followed, and Delia put cups on the table and didn't say a word about doorways or distances or the particular quality of silences between people who are standing at the edge of something and have not yet decided to step forward. She didn't need to say it. The station held them all, warm and tight against the November dark, and in the morning they would find out what Burr decided, and whatever he decided, they would face it. And that fact, the simple fact of the we in it, the weight and the steadiness of it, was the thing Ruth took to bed with her that night, and held on to like the deed in the strongbox, like something that was hers and was not going to be taken. Burr was gone by morning. Cole found out from the hotel keeper when he rode into town at first light. Burr had settled his bill at midnight, taken the horse he'd stabled at the livery, and ridden north without a word to anyone about where he was going. His room was clean, no papers left behind. The kind of departure that belonged to a man who had looked at his position and decided the arithmetic no longer worked in his favor. Cole rode back to the station and told Ruth over breakfast. She listened with both hands around her coffee cup,
And when he finished, she sat quiet for a moment, and he could see her deciding whether to believe it was over or whether this was the kind of quiet that preceded something worse. "He ran," she said. "Looks like. Or he wants us to think he ran." "Could be." Cole sat down across from her. "But Burr is a businessman, not a soldier. When an operation gets documented and distributed to 3 separate offices, and the territorial commissioner has turned state's evidence on your conversation, the cost-benefit stops working. He'll cut his losses and find a cleaner property on the corridor." He paused. "We're not worth it anymore. That was the point." Ruth looked at him steadily. "You sound certain." "I sound like a man who spent 2 years studying how Burr thinks." He held her gaze. "He doesn't fight battles he can't win quietly. Noise is his enemy. We made noise." She nodded slowly, not relieved. Ruth Calloway did not do relief easily. He'd learned that much. But something in her shoulders shifted that had been held tight for days. "Then we wait for Greer," she said. They waited 9 days. The wire from Arthur Greer came on a Thursday, and Ruth read it standing at the relay counter, with Cole beside her, and Delia at the kitchen doorway, and Will Pruitt pretending to be very interested in a bridle hook on the wall. The joint tenancy challenge had been dismissed. The deed registration, countersigned by Commissioner Cooley, had been accepted and recorded. The Calloway Station deed stood clean, uncontested, and legally unassailable under territorial law. Ruth read it twice. She folded it in quarters. She put it in her shirt pocket over her heart, which Cole noticed and did not comment on. "Well," Delia said from the doorway. "Well," Ruth agreed. Will Pruitt let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "So we're keeping it. The station." "We're keeping it," Ruth said. That evening, a rider came from the Denver and Pacific Railroad's territorial office. Not a letter this time, an actual representative, a young man named Patterson, with clean boots and careful manners, who said the railroad had received Ruth's correspondence and was prepared to discuss the corridor acquisition at fair market value at her convenience, and that the company's preference was to deal directly with the deed holder rather than through intermediaries. Ruth showed him to a chair and offered him coffee, and conducted the conversation with the same precise, unhurried attention she brought to everything. And when it was finished, and Patterson had ridden back toward town with an appointment for the following week in his coat pocket, she stood on the porch for a long time without moving. Cole came out and stood beside her. "You don't have to sell," he said. "I know. The land value goes up whether you sell the corridor strip or not. The railroad will build around a holdout if they have to, though they'd rather not. You have leverage now that you didn't have a month ago." "I know that too." She looked at the eastern pasture, at the survey stakes. Daniel saw the value in this land before anyone was willing to say it plainly to him. He was right. He was just working with people who wanted to profit from his being right, without paying him for it. She paused. "I want the railroad to pay me what it's worth, not what Whitfield would have gotten for it after stealing it. Patterson's company will deal fair if you hold the line on price." "I intend to." She looked at him. "I want you in that meeting." "It's your land, Ruth. And you know how these companies argue value. And I need someone in that room who can tell when the number they're offering is the real number and when they're still leaving room." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to run it. I'm asking you to sit beside me and tell me when to push." He nodded. "All right." The night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that had a clean edge to it, not the brutal, pressing cold of deep winter, but the sharp, promising cold of a season that had arrived and intended to stay a while. Somewhere in the relay barn, a horse moved,
and from the kitchen came the smell of whatever Delia was doing that involved cinnamon. And the station was quiet and whole and still theirs. "Cole?" Ruth said. "Yeah?" She turned to face him directly, which she did when she meant to say something she'd prepared, something she'd decided on, rather than something that just came out. He'd learned to read the difference. 6 months, she said. That was the agreement. Through February, past the acquisition deadline. Yes. February's in 10 weeks. He looked at her. He didn't say anything because he understood she was getting to something and she didn't need prompting to get there. "I want to renegotiate," she said. The silence that followed lasted long enough to mean something. "What terms?" he said carefully. Longer than 6 months. She held his gaze without looking away, which cost her something. He could see that, the deliberate exposure of it. "I've been running this station for 3 years alone, and I was managing. I wasn't building anything. I was holding the line and calling it enough, because enough was all I thought I had left." She paused. "Since you came, I've filed a deed defense and a counter-challenge, documented a criminal operation, turned a land commissioner, opened direct negotiations with a railroad, and hired a hand who's already worth twice what I'm paying him." She stopped. "That's what 2 people do that 1 person can't. I knew that mathematically. I understand it differently now." Cole turned to face her fully. "You're talking about partnership." "I'm talking about what comes after February," she said. "If you want it." "Ruth, I know it's complicated. I know there's Henry Carver's brother in Missouri, and whatever unfinished business comes with your real name being on 3 different official documents now. I know you came here carrying something I can't take from you, and I'm not trying to." She kept her voice steady and direct, because that was the only way she knew how to say true things. "I'm saying I want you to stay. Not for the station, for the life that's possible here, which is larger than it was before you came, and which I would rather build with you than maintain alone." Cole was quiet for long enough that she felt the cold more acutely, felt the exposure of standing in it with her whole meaning visible and no way to take it back. Then he said, "I fell in love with you sometime around the 3rd morning, when you told Delia that your dignity was not the thing you were worried about." Ruth blinked. "I didn't say anything," he continued, his voice low and steady, "because you'd hired me for a purpose, and I wasn't going to complicate that with something you hadn't asked for. And then every day after that, there was something else that needed doing, and I kept telling myself, when it's over, when the deed is clear, when Burr is gone, when there's no crisis requiring everything you have." He paused. "There's always going to be something requiring everything you have. That's who you are. I stopped waiting for it to be over." Ruth looked at him in the lamplight coming through the window. This weathered, careful, complicated man who had arrived in her yard with $3,100 and a guilty conscience, and had stayed, not because she'd made it easy, but because he'd decided she was worth the hard parts. "So your answer is yes," she said. "My answer is yes." Something shifted in his face, something that had been held back a long time, releasing itself. "On your terms. I work for you until I've earned the right to say, I work with you. I deal with Henry Carver's brother because it's past time, and running from it isn't protection, it's delay. And I stay." "You deal with Henry Carver's brother," Ruth said, "and I go with you." He stared at her. "You said partnership," she said. "That's what it means. I'm not sending you to Missouri alone to stand in front of a grieving man's anger by yourself. I go with you, we go together, and we come back together." She paused. "That's how this works." Cole looked at her for a long moment with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Fully open, nothing managed or held back. and she understood that nobody in a very long time had said anything to him that landed the way that had.
He took one step forward, and she met him halfway. And he kissed her there, on the porch of the Callaway station, in the November dark. And she put her hand against his jaw and felt the roughness of it and the warmth of him in the cold air, and kissed him back with a complete, unhurried certainty of a woman who had made a decision she intended to keep. When they separated, Delia's voice came through the kitchen window, perfectly level. "Coffee's ready." Ruth laughed. Actually laughed, full and real, the first time in so long that the sound surprised even her. Cole smiled, and it was the most unguarded she'd seen him, the careful control entirely gone, just the man underneath it. "She knew," Ruth said. "She knew before we did," Cole agreed. They went inside. The meeting with Patterson from the Denver and Pacific Railroad happened on a Tuesday. Ruth sat at the head of the table in the station's front room, and Patterson sat across from her, with his careful manners and his company's opening number, which was $1,100 for the corridor strip. And Ruth looked at it, and looked at Cole, and Cole's expression told her they were still leaving room. So she said, $2,200. And Patterson said, that was beyond their authorization. And Ruth said, then you'll need to wire whoever has that authorization. And Patterson wired Denver that afternoon. Denver said $1,800. Ruth said $20. Denver, after 2 days, said $1,900. And Ruth said, agreed. And Patterson wrote out a contract that Ruth read in full, and Cole read after her, and Greer reviewed by wire before she signed it. $1,900. Clean, legal, at fair market value, to the deed holder directly, with a permanent right-of-way easement that preserved the station's access to the eastern pasture for grazing and operations in perpetuity. When Patterson rode away with the signed contract, Ruth stood in the yard and looked at the eastern pasture where the survey stakes had been and were now gone, pulled up by Will Pruitt that morning because Ruth had asked him to, and he'd done it without asking why. And she thought about Daniel standing at the desk in 1876, looking at that red pencil line and seeing the future. He'd been right about every part of it except the man who helped him get there. She'd corrected that part. Whitfield came to the station one last time in December, driving himself in a single carriage, no assessors, no legal man, no deputy with a hand on his gun. He stepped down and stood in the yard, and Ruth came out to the porch, and they looked at each other across the cold distance. I want you to know, Whitfield said, that Burr acted outside the scope of what I authorized. The deed challenge, coolly. I didn't sanction any of that. You benefited from it, Ruth said. I was prepared to benefit from it. That's not the same thing. Close enough. She looked at him steadily. What do you want, Mr. Whitfield? He looked at the station, at the relay barn with its new roof, at the corral where 3 of Daniel's horses stood in the pale winter light. He looked like a man who had come to say something specific and was deciding whether to actually say it. You could have been bought out fairly at the beginning, he said. If you'd known the railroad was coming, known the real value. I should have come to you directly instead of working through the debt. Yes, Ruth said, you should have. I'm saying I was wrong about how I went about it. I know what you're saying. She held his gaze. It doesn't change what happened, but I'll remember you said it. Whitfield put his hat back on. He looked at Cole, who had come to stand in the station doorway and was watching without expression. Mason, he said. Whitfield, Cole said. Whitfield nodded once, the smallest possible acknowledgement of something that didn't have a name, and got back in his carriage and drove away. Cole came to stand beside Ruth on the porch. They watched the carriage go down the road until it turned at the bend. That was almost an apology, Cole said. Almost is about what I expected from him.
She looked at the empty road. He'll find another corridor property. He'll find another way. Probably. But not this one. No, Cole said. Not this one. The Territorial Marshal's Office in Wichita sent word in January that Silas Burr had been located in Denver, where he'd made the mistake of continuing to operate while being the subject of an active investigation. He was arrested on 4 counts of fraudulent debt acquisition and 2 counts of wire manipulation, with the Cooley documentation and Cole's 11 pages as the evidentiary foundation. The marshal's letter thanked Mrs. R.A.
Calloway for her cooperation and noted that the statement provided by a Mr. C. Mason had been particularly useful in establishing the pattern of Burr's operations across 3 territories. Ruth put that letter in the strongbox beside the deed. Cole wrote to Henry Carver's brother in February. He wrote the letter at Daniel's desk on a Sunday afternoon, while Ruth was in the relay barn with the horses. And he wrote it by himself, because some things a man had to do in his own voice, in his own hand, without anyone taking the weight of it from him. He told the truth, all of it, without softening or justifying, and he sent it before he could find reasons not to. The reply came 3 weeks later. Ruth was there when Cole read it, sitting across the table, the way she'd sat across from him the morning he'd first told her about Henry. And she watched his face while he read it, and she could see what the letter contained in the way his shoulders changed as he got to the end of it. He set it down. He was quiet for a moment.
He says he knows it was an accident, Cole said. He says he's been angry at someone for 4 years, and he's tired of being angry at someone who can't hear it. He paused. He says Clara remarried in 1878, that she has 2 children, and she's well. He looked at the letter. He says he doesn't forgive me because it's not his forgiveness to give, but he says he doesn't hold it anymore. Ruth reached across the table and put her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held on to hers and looked at the wall for a moment. And she sat with him and did not say anything because there was nothing to say. Some things you just sat with until they had room to breathe. After a while, he looked at her. I need to put this in the strongbox. Yes, she said. It belongs there. They were married on the first Saturday in April, the spring coming in fast and green the way it did on the Kansas border, with the smell of new grass and the horses restless in the pastures from the warmth. Delia stood beside Ruth, and Will Pruitt stood beside Cole, and the circuit preacher said the words, and Ruth said yes, and Cole said, I do, and meant it the way men mean things they have arrived at slowly, completely, without any part of themselves left outside it. The preacher asked if anyone had a ring, and Cole took a piece of cord from his pocket and tied it carefully around Ruth's finger, and said he'd get her a proper ring in town on Monday. And Ruth said, this one's fine. And she meant that, too. Delia made a cake with the last of the winter sugar, and Will Pruitt played the harmonica, badly and enthusiastically. And the station was warm and full and loud in a way it hadn't been since before Daniel died. And Ruth stood in the middle of it and felt something complete itself inside her that she hadn't known was incomplete, because she'd been too busy surviving to look for it. Later, after Delia and Will had gone to their respective corners of the station, and the horses were settled, and the night had gone quiet around them, Ruth and Cole sat on the porch together in the April dark. His shoulder was warm against hers. The cord on her finger was an ordinary piece of rope that she was not going to replace on Monday or any other day. Tell me something, Cole said. What? What do you want this to look like, 5 years from now? 10. Ruth thought about it, not the careful planning way, not the defensive surviving way she'd been thinking about the future for 3 years, but the open way,
The way Daniel had looked at a red pencil line on a survey map and seen possibility instead of threat. "I want the station to be what Daniel thought it could be," she said. "A proper operation. Big enough to need real staff. Good enough that the railroad sends us their best contracts." She paused. "I want Delia to have a house that's hers, not a room in someone else's building. She's earned it." She paused again. "And I want to stop sleeping with one ear on the door. I want to wake up in the morning and have the first thing I think about not be what's coming for us."
"Nothing's coming for us," Cole said. "Not anymore."
"I know."
She looked at the relay barn, solid and new-roofed against the April sky.
"That's going to take some getting used to."
"Take all the time you need."
She leaned against him and felt him settle his arm around her. And the station was quiet around them, and the eastern pasture where the survey stakes had been was dark and empty and entirely theirs. And somewhere in the relay barn, the gray mare shifted in her stall, and the night was full of the ordinary sounds of a place that was working and whole and cared for. Ruth Calloway, who had buried her husband and nearly lost everything he'd died to protect, who had stood on this porch with chalk marks on her door and $87 in a strongbox, and found a way forward anyway. Ruth Calloway had not been rescued. She had been met by a man who arrived at exactly the right moment, carrying exactly the right weight, who had needed what she had as much as she had needed what he brought, and who had proven in the particular way that mattered most, not in the grand moment, but in the 100 ordinary moments after it, that he was the kind of man who stayed. The station was theirs. The deed was clean. The land was paid for in full, in the right currency, at the right price, by the right people. And the woman who had once stood alone in a cold yard, watching men chalk-mark everything she had left in the world, sat now in the April warmth with her husband beside her, and looked out at the land she had fought for and held, and knew with the complete and unshakable certainty of someone who has been through the worst and come out holding something real, that this, all of it, the work and the cost and the grief and the improbable grace of the stranger who had arrived when she needed him most, this was exactly enough. More than enough. This was home.